Our next story in the Utopia unit is Harrison Bergeron, written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Now, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. published this story in 1961. He started writing it much earlier than that. And you have to understand that there was a lot of things going on in the United States at that time. It was a great time of civil unrest. Not only did you have the equal rights movement being led by Martin Luther King Jr., but women were starting to fight more for equal rights. Actually, they started back in the 1920s, but it was really, thanks to World War II, becoming a much bigger deal. There was a lot of things going on, but the biggest threat was the Communist Revolution and the Cold War. America was afraid, or Americans, I should say, were afraid of the communists, of the nations of Russia and China. They were the two largest nations in the world. And communism was the exact opposite of what we wanted to have here in America. In America, we embrace equal rights, we embrace individual rights, we embrace the ability to own property, to seek wealth, and you have the potential to get rich if you work hard enough. Communism was just the opposite. Communism seized all property, seized all wealth. Now, not only were Russia and China communist, but they were trying to convert other countries to communism. And so they were actively supporting revolutions in other nations, Yugoslavia, Poland, and if they couldn't support the people, they would subversively go in and take over certain nations. They were no better than Hitler in this sense. They were trying to take over the world slowly for communism. You've heard about the Korean and the Vietnam Wars. These are examples where China actually sent full military aid to North Korea and North Vietnam. The United States sent military aid to South Korea and South Vietnam. And the Russians lent economic and other forms of support to the northern halves. In 1848, this all started when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, which was a pamphlet where he said, this is what the perfect society should be. This is a utopia. So a lot of people said, this isn't a bad idea, because he talked about the fact that the working class does all the real jobs and supports the economy, keeps the nation running. Without the working class, there would be no upper class. So why does the upper class have all the money? That we should seize the money from the upper class and distribute it among the working class, take care of the poor, and nobody has to suffer. Everybody has their basic needs met. Well, taking this idea into hand in 1917, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and several other men began a Russian Revolution. They executed the royalty, the czars, the equivalent of kings and queens, and their children. Anybody of royal blood was killed, and they took over the country and established what would be called the USSR. In 1949, the Chinese did the same thing, establishing the People's Republic of China. Now, in a communist nation, a dictator, or a group of dictators, as in China's case, has absolute control. The government controls everything from your personal rights to your choices. There is no personal property, no personal money. Everything is owned and controlled by the government. 10 essential elements of communism is all money goes into the central banking system, which is the government's bank. So basically the government has all the money. Education is decided by the government. The government decides what you're going to learn. The government decides what job you're going to do. They test you to see what your talents are, what your skills are, and they educate you based on that and then put you into a job based on that information. The government owns all transportation, all taxis, buses, trains. You don't get to own a personal car. And communication vehicles refers to telephones, televisions, radios, newspapers. All form of information is controlled by the government. The government owns the farms and factories. You can't own property. You can't own a business. Everything is controlled by the government. You can't even own simple things like a car, a television, a radio, your own furniture. You don't own your own clothes. You basically, everything is given to you by the government, and the government can take it away anytime it wants. There's a heavy income tax which is kind of strange considering that you're not supposed to have money, but they did pay people for their jobs. It wasn't much money, and what money they did get paid, again, most of it went right back to the government in the form of taxes. So nobody really had any money to do anything with. And what did they spend their money on? Usually on the black market, so that people from other nations would sneak in blue jeans, Levi's, and sell them at an outrageous price to the Russian people because they couldn't get them in Russia. Coca-Cola was another thing that was heavily smuggled into Russia. You couldn't inherit money. Your parents died, family member died, all that money went straight to the communist government. Nothing. There was no possessions to leave to anybody anyway. And the government decided what was going to be done in your neighborhood. Were houses going up? Were roads going to get improved? Were you going to get a grocery store? Would you have a movie theater? Everything was decided by the government. You couldn't say, we'd like to have this. The government said, too bad, we'll decide what you get. Americans feared that the communists might take over the United States because we'd already seen it. The Russians and the Chinese, just like Hitler, were absorbing countries near their borders. They were expanding their control. Excuse me. They were encouraging communist revolutions in other nations and then said, well, since you're now communist, you're now part of the USSR, the People's Republic of China, and we have control over you. We're going to tell you what to do. Another thing that scared us was in 1949, the Russians developed a nuclear bomb. Hey, when America's no longer the only country with the bomb, we are no longer superior. Now we have somebody who can blast us just as bad as we can blast them. This is where the term mutual self-destruction comes from. If we bomb you, you'll bomb us, and we both die. This also was the beginning of the race for space. In the 1950s, the Russians launched Sputnik, the first space satellite. They launched the dog into space. They launched the first man into space, I can't remember his name now. Yuri Gagarin. And they sent him up into space. We were falling behind, so we had to rush, hurry it up. We managed to beat them to the moon. The idea here was that once we got in outer space, we would set up military bases, floating space stations, stations on the moon, and we would be able to launch weapons, bombs, planes, whatever, from outer space. We didn't really understand how space worked at that time. We didn't realize that atmosphere didn't just keep going on forever. And so once we got to the moon, we realized this is an impossible idea. But this was often called the Red Scare. Why was it called the Red Scare? Because Russia and China, in their revolutions, used the color red as their symbol. They wore red shirts and used red in other ways to recognize each other as fellow communists or socialists. Now, back in America, we were afraid. We were looking for anybody who might be a communist, anybody who might be out to destroy the American way of life. And so Congress established groups to look out for anti-American activities. The FBI was on patrol looking for anti-American activities. Any form of protest was seen as a threat to the United States government. The FBI wanted to shut down Martin Luther King Jr. and the Equal Rights Movement. They wanted to stop women seeking equal rights. They wanted to get rid of the hippies. Anyone they thought was different. Anybody who might start a revolution. Remember the Beatles song? You're talking about a revolution. Well, that's kind of what they're talking about in that song. Unions, which supported the rights of workers, were often seen as socialist, dangerous. Well, unions supported the rights of the workers, and in communist revolutions, what they did was they said the working class needs to rise up and overthrow their leaders. So anything that was providing power and authority to workers was seen as a threat to the existing government. In 1951, the Americans discovered, actually I should say the FBI uncovered that the Rosenbergs, a married couple, were selling secrets to the Russians. This could be how the Russians got the bomb so quickly. This is a bad thing. So, we don't know how much the Russians know now. How far caught up are they with all our secrets? How much do they have military superiority to us now? Again, we could fall, our government could fall to the Russians. So, Congress formed something called the House Un-American Activities Committee, called HUAC. And its job was to look for traitors. Unfortunately, what they wound up doing was hunting down homosexuals, artists musicians, actors, anybody who led an unusual lifestyle, anybody who wasn't a normal American. So this became a very bad time, and a lot of people left America and went to live in Europe because of this. You see all these people protesting, people who protested the bomb, or no nuclear bomb, while they were seen as communists. What? Communists supported the nuclear bomb. This is ridiculous. Women who wanted to have the rights to control their bodies, wanted abortion made legal, were seen as communists. What? And what made things worse was television. Television was new in the 1950s. For the first time, we could see instantly what was going on. We could go somewhere live and show you actual pictures of what was happening. And people were seeing these things. They were seeing the protests. They were seeing these rallies. And they were scared. There was a lot of violence going on. And they weren't sure what was going to happen. Now Vonnegut, remember our author, and that we're reading a story, Kurt Vonnegut thought this was kind of funny. That a country like America, which in its Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, all people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, are now fighting for those rights, that the government is denying them to them. So he began to ask himself what was so dangerous about this need for equality, this protest, this fight for equality. And he wrote Harrison Bergeron as a result. And what we need to understand about equality is, what does equal really mean? This is the thing that that Vonnegut is examining, is what does it truly mean to be equal? In mathematics, it's pretty clear. What's on one side of the equal side must be the same as what's on the other side of the equal sign. It can be expressed differently, like 1 plus 1 and 2. They both are the same ultimately when you think about it, but they're expressed differently. Okay, well that's pretty logical. But it also means that socially, when we really think about it, we are all human beings, and all human beings should have the same rights and opportunities. Just because someone is fat, balding, and wears glasses and old doesn't mean that I shouldn't have the same rights as a young girl who's pretty and has white skin. So no matter what your race is, your religion is, no matter your skin color, your hair color, your height, your weight, whether you have a handicap, whether you are athletically fit, it doesn't matter. We should all have the same rights. But can we ever truly be equal? What does it mean to force everyone into true equality? That is the point of the story of Harrison Bergeron. So let's start the story. Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., published in October 1961. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the Handicapper General men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantages of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm.
That was a real pretty dance. The dance they just did, said Hazel.
Uh-huh, said George.
The dance.
It was real nice, said Hazel. Yup, said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good. No better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or pretty face, would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George.
I think it would be real interesting, hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up.
Said George.
Only, if I was handicapped general, you know what I would do? Said Hazel.
Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strange resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Glompers.
If I was Diana Moon Glompers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes. Kinda in honor of religion.
I could think if it was just chimes, said George.
Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general.
As good as anybody else, said George.
Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel.
Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison. But a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that.
Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it?
It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor and were holding their temples.
All of a sudden, you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so that you can rest your handicap bags on the pillows, honey bunch?
She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck.
Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while.
George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me.
You've been so tired lately. Kind of wore out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of that bag and just take out a few of them lead balls. Just a few.
2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain.
If you could just take out a few when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around.
If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people get away with it. And pretty soon, we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you?
I'd hate it, said Hazel.
Well, there you are, said George. The minute people start cheating laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head.
You know, I reckon it would all fall apart, said Hazel.
What? What would? Said George blankly.
Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said?
Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about a half a minute, in a high state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen," but he finally gave up and handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read.
That's all right, Hazel said to the announcer. He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard.
"Ladies and gentlemen," said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was a warm, luminous, timeless melody. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive.
Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous.
A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween in hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the handicapper general man could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him whining headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the handicapper general men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random.
If you see this boy, said the ballerina, do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him.
There was the shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again, as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have. For many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. "My God," said George, "that must be Harrison." The realization was blasted by his mind instantly from the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George opened his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hands. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor!" cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor! Everybody must do what I say at once!" And he stamped his foot, and the studio shook. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now, watch me become what I can become!" Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. "I shall now select my empress," he said, looking down on the cowering people. "Let the first woman who dare rise to her feet claim her mate and her throne." A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. "Now," said Harrison, taking her hand, "shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance?" "Music!" he commanded. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. "Play your best," he told them, "and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls." The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false, but Harrison snatched two musicians from their chairs and waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. He slammed them back into their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely, as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weight to their toes. Harrison placed its big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gambled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio's ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap took the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Gloppers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice. And the Emperor and the Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Gloppers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused, while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. You've been crying, he said to Hazel.
Yup,
she said. What about, he said.
I forget. Something real sad on television.
What was it, he said.
It's all kind of mixed up in my mind, said Hazel.
Forget sad things, said George.
I always do, said Hazel.
That's my girl, said George. He winced. There was the sound of a riveting gun in his head.
Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy, said Hazel.
You can say that again, said George.
Gee, said Hazel, I could tell that one was a doozy.
You're supposed to laugh at that. Now, let's actually go back and look at this story and how Vonnegut gets his point across. We start off, it's the year 2081, so obviously it's going to take 120 years for us to get to this stage from when he published the story now. Of course, we're only 61 years away from it now. Took a lot of amendments to get us there, but now we have established true equality. And for some reason, George and Hazel's son, Harrison, who is 14 years old, is arrested. Now, you'd think that George and Hazel would be very upset about this. Why aren't they upset? Well, because George can't stop to think about it because these blasts keep going off in his ear. Every time he starts to think about something, bam, these loud sounds hit, and he can't think. He's totally shook up, and he loses his train of thought. Hazel, on the other hand, is really dumb. She can't remember anything. Doesn't take her long to forget. She has no short-term memory, no long-term memory. She's just, it's gone. She's already forgotten, in fact, that her son's been arrested. So they sit down to watch TV, and they're watching the ballerinas. And so this allows them to discuss this concept of equality. Hazel, being dumb, doesn't really understand what this is all about. She says, it would be nice to let the dancers dance, and it would be nice to let you, George, relax once in a while. You don't always have to be handicapped. George reminds her about the law, and it's important that we know the law, that there's a huge fine if you break it, if you try to be better than somebody else. And so we get past that point. We get to see how many times poor George is tortured with the sounds in his ears. And finally we get to the point. Now this is interesting. Whoops, let me go back one. George tells us that if I tried to get away with it, then other people would get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? Oh, I'd hate it. Why would Hazel hate competition? Because she can't compete. She's just too ordinary. She's too nothing. She's dumb. She's not pretty. She's not strong. She's not fast. She doesn't have any special skills. So she would hate society because she can't do anything. Now, of course, there's nobody that bad in the real world, but Vonnegut's trying to make a point here. Now, George, on the other hand, listen to what he said. If I try to get away with it, then other people get away with it. Does that sound familiar? Do we go back to the lottery? Some towns have gotten rid of the lottery. Stupid fools.
Pretty soon, we'd be back to the old days, living in caves and eating chickweed.
Can't imagine how life could be any different, can we? We get to doing something and we forget that we don't have to do it like that. We get the government controlling us, controlling what we know, controlling our ability to think. So we just go along with things. So if he decided to try to take some weight off of himself, why, oh my gosh, society would fall apart. Hazel figured that much out. But of course, George can't think any further because the noises in his ears keep going off. So then they get to watch the television program. Think about this. You're watching TV and the announcer who comes on to give you your news bulletins has a speech impediment. Ladies, oh my God, I go nuts listening to that. And the dancers are pretty bad, and the musicians are really bad, because everybody has to be bad so that nobody is jealous of anybody who's good, nobody who's good looking, nobody with talent. So then we get to see what happens. Harrison Bergeron, he's 14 years old. He's 7 feet tall. This boy is super strong. He's super handsome. Oh my gosh, we would worship him in our society today. But here he's a threat to society because he's so much better than everybody else. What could he have contributed? What could he have done to improve our world? Instead, he gets shot for daring to be better than everybody else. We must all be equal. And so the handicapper general, she comes in and she shoots him, and she shoots the ballerina, makes everybody put their handicaps back on. And the really sad part about all this is that Hazel watched it all. George got up just before the handicapper general came into the room, so he got up to get a beer, so he doesn't see this part. He's in the kitchen rattling around grabbing a beer can. Meanwhile, on television, Hazel is watching her son be murdered, and she starts to cry. George comes back in. Now the television is burned out. I don't think the television really burned out. I think the government just shut it all down. Point was made. Now don't watch anything. George sits down. Now he didn't see what happened. He looks at Hazel and says, "What's going on? Why are you crying?" She says, "I can't remember. I forget. There was something sad on television. What was it? I don't know. I can't remember." So George doesn't get to know what happened. This is the point here. If George had really seen this, if George had seen his son get shot, do you think he would have tolerated his handicaps anymore? Or do you think he would have ripped that handicap out of his ear, would have dropped those bags of birdshot? Maybe he would be the next Harrison Bergeron, except he wouldn't be so dumb as to go on television with it. Maybe he would start a quiet revolution. But since he wasn't in the room, it can't happen. So society goes on. Now what I want you to do, I want you to think about this story, this concept of everybody being equal. Understand, we can't raise everybody up. We can't make everybody special. We can't make everybody great runners, great thinkers, great dancers, great singers. Right now it's not possible, although with genetics, who knows, in the future it could be. But right now we can't. So, how does this apply to your life today? The Cold War's ended. We obviously can't raise people up to make them equal. The story is dumbing everybody down. Oh, wait a minute. Dumbing people down? It keeps lowering the bar. Gee, does this sound familiar? Think back to your experiences in high school, in middle school, elementary school. Think back to going through the public school system. And if you didn't go through the public school system, why were you in private school? Why did your parents spend all that money to send you to a private school when you could have gone to public school for free? And for those of you who aren't from this country, who got your education in another country, find out what our public school system's really like. And look at what this story is telling us. Do you see how it still applies today? Dumbing down America, why Johnny can't read, keep lowering the bar, the tests that you guys take every year. When they first started those tests back in 2001 or 2, it was right after 9/11, so I think it was 2002. No Child Left Behind. George Bush put these in place. You had to take a test every year to prove that you were learning something. But guess what? Everybody was failing the test. The tests were too hard. So instead of improving the education system so that you learned enough to pass the test, they just simplified the test. And they kept simplifying the test every year. Originally, the test had an essay attached to it. They got rid of the essay after 5 years. This is too hard. By the time we get to where you guys are now, I don't think there's an essay. It's multiple guess, and the questions are so easy. My dog could probably pass it. It's sad. I want you to read this article attached here, the No Child Left Behind Act. Click on that, and you'll get this article. Read through the article and see what it has to tell you about the No Child Left Behind Act and about what's happened with our education system. The fact that below 50% or more couldn't pass these tests. Did this thing make sense? What were we doing? We were doing exactly what Vonnegut predicted would happen. We just kept making things easier so that nobody would feel bad about themselves. A trophy for everyone. Get that out of there. Okay? So, then I want you to write me a 2-page response. So after you've read the article and you think about this story, tell me something about your personal life, about your experience with education, and tell me how this connects to you. Show me that you can use this story in connection with your real life. Okay? This is worth 10 points. All right. Take care now. Everybody stay healthy, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.